The sun over the Rolling Pines Country Club didn't feel like the kind of sun that warmed you. It felt like the kind of sun that watched you. It beat down on the back of Ilias's neck, turning his sweat into a cold itch under his white caddy vest. This bag probably cost more than his mother's car, and the clubs inside it custom-made. Polished to a mirror shine were worth a year of his tuition. He was 17, and his world was measured in yards and wind directions. Standing. A few feet away was Mr. Sterling. Sterling didn't look like a man who worked for a living. He looked like a man who owned the idea of work. He was 60, with hair the color of a silver coin and a face that seemed permanently set in a look of mild disappointment. He was currently obsessing over a small white ball, as if it were the center of the universe. "Wind's picking up from the east, sir," Elias said softly. He didn't speak unless he was spoken to, but a good caddy knew when to offer the truth. "The green slopes more than it looks. Aim 3 inches to the left of the cup." Sterling didn't acknowledge him. He just grunted, swung, and watched as the ball sliced through the air, landing exactly where Elias had suggested. "Lucky guess, kid," Sterling muttered. Handing the putter back without looking, they walked toward the 9th hole in silence. While the other caddies spent their breaks scrolling through their phones or complaining about the heat, Elias listened. He listened to the way these men talked about interest rates, about shipping lanes, and about the bottlenecks that kept them up at night. Elias wasn't just a kid carrying bags. He was a kid with a notebook in his pocket and a library card that was worn thin from use. He spent his nights in a small apartment where the radiator hissed like a wounded animal, teaching himself the logic of systems. He saw the world as a series of connected pipes. If one got clogged, the whole thing backed up. By the time they reached the 10th tee, Sterling was joined by 2 other men in expensive polos. They weren't talking about golf anymore. They were talking about the logistics nightmare. "It's the port in Savannah," Sterling said, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "We have 40 containers of electronics sitting on the water. We can't get the truck scheduled because the software keeps flagging the loads as incomplete. It's costing us $50,000 a day in standing fees. My engineers say it's a glitch in the routing algorithm." "They've been staring at it for a week." The other men nodded, offering useless sympathies. Elias felt a strange hum in his chest. He knew that problem. He had spent the last 3 months reading open-source code for shipping manifests because he was bored and curious. He knew exactly why the software was flagging those loads. It wasn't a glitch. It was a conflict between the weight sensors and the regional holiday scheduling. His heart started to hammer against his ribs. He knew he should stay quiet. He was a teenager from the east side. He was the help. But the math in his head was so clear. It was like a bright light he couldn't turn off. As Sterling reached for his driver, Elias cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in the quiet of the tee box it sounded like a gunshot, sir, Elias asked. Sterling paused, his club halfway to the ground. He looked at Elias as if he had just noticed a blade of grass was out of place. "You need a water break?" "No, sir," Elias said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I was listening to you talk about the Savannah port issue. The containers, I think. I think your engineers are looking at the wrong end of the code." The 2 other men chuckled. Sterling didn't laugh yet. He just stared, his eyes narrowing. "You think you know about global logistics, do you? I know that your software is likely using a standard Euclidean algorithm for the truck routes," Elias said, stepping forward just an inch. "But it's not accounting for the bridge height restrictions that were updated last month. The software thinks the trucks are too heavy for the route, so it marks the load as impossible. If you just bypass the bridge sensor and reroute through the northern gate, the flag will drop. You could have those containers moving by tonight." The silence that followed was heavy. A bird chirped in a nearby oak tree. Then Sterling's shoulders began to shake. It started as a wheeze, then it turned into a full-throated roar of laughter. He leaned on his driver, clutching his side. The other 2 men joined in, their laughter echoing across the manicured lawn. "The caddy," Sterling gasped, pointing a finger at Elias. "The caddy is going to fix a multi-million-dollar shipping firm. Did you hear that? He's a genius. He's the next king of tech. Elias felt the blood rush to his face. The heat of the sun was nothing compared to the heat of the shame. He stood perfectly still, his hands gripping the straps of the bag until his knuckles turned white. "Listen to me, son," Sterling said, finally catching his breath. He stepped closer, his voice dropping, but the mockery still sharp in his eyes. "You're a hard worker. You've got a good eye for the wind. But look around you. This is a game for men who built the world. You don't get to sit at the table just because you read a book. Stick to the clubs. If you start thinking you're smarter than you are, you'll end up broke and bitter. Now, get the bag. We're burning daylight." Elias didn't say a word. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He simply picked up the bag and walked. But something inside him shifted. The humiliation didn't break him. It hardened him. As he trudged behind Sterling for the next 9 holes, Elias made a silent vow. He looked at Sterling's backet, the expensive fabric of his shirt, and the arrogant swing of his arms. Elias realized that the millionaire wasn't laughing because the idea was bad. He was laughing because he couldn't imagine that a nobody could hold the key to his somebody problems. That evening, when Elias finished his shift, he didn't go home to eat. He went straight to the public library. He sat at the back computer, the one with the flickering screen, and opened his notebook. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Apex Flow." He began to type. His fingers flew across the keyboard, translating the logic in his head into lines of cold, beautiful code. He wasn't just building a solution for Sterling anymore. He was building a system that would one day make Sterling's entire way of doing business look like a relic of the past. The library lights flickered, signaling they were closing. The librarian, a kind woman who knew Elias by name, walked over and put a hand on his shoulder. "You're going to be a success one day, aren't you?" she whispered. Elias looked at the screen, then at the dark window where he could see his own reflection, a tired boy in a stained khaki vest. "No," Elias said quietly. "I'm going to be the person they never saw coming." The 3 years that followed the day at the golf course were not filled with cinematic montages or sudden windfalls of cash. They were filled with the smell of stale coffee, the hum of a cheap cooling fan, and the constant dull ache of exhaustion. Elias graduated from high school without a party or a celebration. While his classmates were picking out outfits for prom or talking about which state university they would attend, Elias was picking up double shifts at a local warehouse in a late night, gig cleaning floors at a diner. He didn't mind the work. In fact, he found a strange kind of peace in it. The warehouse was a living laboratory, or a driver sat idling for 2 hours because the paperwork hadn't been processed. Elias saw a line of code in his head. He saw the friction in the world. He realized that the great men like Mr. Sterling weren't actually geniuses. They were just people who had been lucky enough to get there first, and they were now too comfortable to see how broken their own systems were. His office was a corner of the kitchen table in the apartment he shared with his mother. She worked as a nurse's assistant, coming home with swollen ankles and a back that never stopped hurting. She would see him hunched over his laptop, a refurbished machine he'd bought for $80 from a pawn shop, and she would set a plate of food next to him without saying a word. She didn't understand what the lines of green text on the black screen meant, but she understood the look in her son's eyes. It was the same look her father had when he was trying to farm a patch of land that the rain had forgotten. It was the look of a man who refused to be defeated by the earth. "You need to sleep, Elias," she would say softly, rubbing his shoulder. "Just 1 more hour, Ma," he'd reply. "I almost have the routing engine optimized. If I can get it to predict the traffic patterns in the industrial district, I can save a single truck for gallons of fuel a day. Just 1 truck." She would kiss the top of his head and go to bed, leaving him in the blue light of the monitor. The struggle wasn't just about time. It was about the isolation. Elias had friends, or at least he used to. There was a boy from the neighborhood, Leo, who used to play basketball with him. Leo would stop by the diner while Elias was mopping and lean against the counter. "Man, come out with us," Leo would say, spinning a ball on his finger. Big T is having a party. Everyone's going to be there. You're becoming a ghost, Elias. You're working 3 jobs, and then you go home to play with a calculator. For what? So you can get rich. Look at us. We aren't those people. Just live a little. Elias would look at the soapy water in his bucket, and then at Leo. He didn't feel superior to Leo. If anything, he felt a pang of envy. It would be so easy to just go to the party. It would be so easy to accept that his life was meant to be lived in this 3-block radius. But then he would hear it. In the back of his mind, like a ghost in the room, he would hear Sterling's laughter. The caddy. The caddy is going to fix a shipping firm. That laugh was his battery. Every time he felt his eyelids getting heavy or his fingers cramping from typing, he would replay that sound. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that a man who had everything thought that a boy who had nothing was a joke. By the 2nd year, Elias had a working prototype. He called it Apex Flow. It was a simple interface, but underneath, it was a beast. It used real-time data to solve the last-mile delivery problem. He began cold calling local businesses. He wasn't looking for millionaires yet. He was looking for the people who felt the sting of every lost dollar. He finally got a yes. From a man named Mr. Henderson, who ran a small fleet of 5 trucks delivering organic produce to local markets. Henderson was a blunt man with grease under his fingernails. "I don't trust computers, and I don't trust kids," Henderson said, leaning across a desk that smelled of old tobacco. "But my drivers are getting lost in the new construction zones, and I'm losing my shirt on spoiled kale. You say this thing can fix it? Give me 1 week," Elias said. "Don't pay me a dime. Just let me install the bridge on your dispatch computer. If your fuel costs don't drop by 10% in 7 days, I'll uninstall it and walk away." That week was the longest of Elias's life. He didn't sleep at all. He followed the trucks on his laptop from the warehouse, watching the little dots move across the map. When he saw a driver heading toward a closed road, his heart stopped till he saw the software automatically ping the driver's tablet and reroute him 3 minutes before the backup began. On the 8th day, Elias walked into Henderson's office. The old man didn't look up. He just tossed a printed spreadsheet across the desk. "Fuel costs are down 14%. Henderson grunted. "And the drivers aren't screaming at me when they get back to the yard." "How much?" Elias didn't ask for a lot of money. He asked for a testimonial. He asked for the right to use Henderson's data to prove his system worked. He was building a resume out of results, brick by brick. But the world has a way of testing you when you're on the rise. In the 3rd year, his mother got sick. It wasn't a movie sick where everything's dramatic. It was a slow, expensive kind of sick. The bills started piling up on the kitchen table, right next to his laptop. The diner cut his hours. The warehouse changed management and let go of all the part-time staff. Elias found himself standing in front of his laptop one night, his hand hovering over the sell button on a forum where people bought independent code. He could sell the core logic of Apex Flow for $5,000 right now. It would pay the rent. It would cover his mother's medication for 6 months. His hand trembled. He thought about the 3 years. He thought about the library books and the calloused feet. If he sold it now, it would be gone. Someone else would put their name on it. Someone else would build the empire, and he would just be a guy who almost made it. He closed the laptop. He didn't sell. Instead, he went to the diner and asked for the graveyard shift. The one nobody wanted because you had to clean the grease traps in the bathrooms. He worked from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Then he came home and worked on Apex Flow from 7 a.m. to noon. He was skin and bone. He was a shadow of the boy who had carried golf bags. But his mind was sharper than it had ever been. He started to realize that the logistics nightmare Sterling had talked about years ago was getting worse. The world was changing. People were ordering everything online. The old systems were cracking under the weight of the demand. Elias sat in his dark kitchen, looking at a news report on his phone. There was a photo of a massive line of ships waiting outside a port. In the corner of the photo, he saw a familiar face in the background of a press conference. It was Sterling. He looked older. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was losing a fight he didn't understand. Elias didn't laugh. He just opened his laptop and began to code. He wasn't the help anymore. He was the architect of the escape hatch. And he was almost ready to open the door. The world has a strange way of proving people right when they least expect it. For 3 years, Elias had been obsessed with friction, the tiny delays that slowed down the world. He had seen it in the warehouse, in the grocery store aisles, and on the shipping docks. But in the 4th year, the friction didn't just slow things down. It stopped the world entirely, a massive series of storms. Combined with a sudden labor strike at the nation's largest ports, created a bottleneck that the news began calling the Great Gridlock. It wasn't just about electronics anymore. It was about medicine, food, and the very things people needed to survive. On the television in the diner, where Elias still worked the early morning shift, he watched as news anchors stood in front of maps covered in red X marks. The old systems, the ones built by men like Sterling, were failing. They were built for a world that was predictable. This new world was anything but. Elias was sitting at the diner counter, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him, when he saw a familiar face on the screen. It was an interview with Mr. Sterling. The millionaire looked haggard. His expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, and the confidence that had once radiated from him like heat from a radiator was gone. He was explaining why his company's deliveries were 3 weeks behind. "The variables are too high," Sterling said into the microphone, looking defeated. "Between the weather and the port closures, our routing software simply can't find a path. We're looking at hundreds of millions in losses." Elias took a sip of his coffee. He didn't feel joy in Sterling's failure, but he felt a cold, sharp clarity. He knew that Apex Flow could solve it. While Sterling's engineers were trying to force a broken system to work, Elias had built a system that expected things to break. His code thrived on chaos. He went back to his apartment, the one that still smelled like his mother's peppermint tea and the old wood of his desk. He opened his laptop. For the last 6 months, he had been running shadow tests. He'd been feeding real-time global weather data and port status reports into his software, just to see what it would do while the rest of the world's logistics were showing red lines and error messages. Elias's screen was a beautiful, pulsing web of green. His software wasn't looking for the shortest route. It was looking for the resilient route. It was suggesting paths through smaller inland ports that the big companies ignored. It was calculating the exact hour a truck should leave to miss a storm surge. "It's ready," he whispered to the empty room. But having a solution and getting people to listen are two very different things. Elias spent the next 2 weeks in a different kind of war. He wasn't a caddy anymore, and he wasn't just a coder. He had to become a salesman. He didn't have a suit. He didn't have an office. He just had a used laptop and a phone with a cracked screen. He started calling every mid-sized shipping firm in the region. Most of them hung up on him. "I'm busy losing my company, kid. I don't have time for a sales pitch," one manager yelled before the line went dead. Elias didn't stop. He remembered the feeling of carrying that heavy golf bag. He remembered the burn in his legs. This was just another hill to climb. Finally, he got through to a woman named Mrs. Gable. She ran a regional medical supply company. Her situation was desperate. She had 3 trucks filled with life-saving equipment that were stuck somewhere in a 300-mile line of traffic, and her current dispatchers had no idea how to get them out. "I can't pay you up front," she told Elias over the phone, her voice shaking with stress. "If these supplies don't reach the hospitals by tomorrow morning, I won't have a company left to pay you with." "I don't want your money right now," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "I want your data. Give me the GPS coordinates of your drivers and the destination list. I'll send the routes to their phones in 10 minutes. Elias worked through the night. He didn't just use his software. He lived inside it. He watched the weather satellites like a hawk. He found a gravel road that bypassed a flooded highway. He found a small ferry crossing that was still operational but wasn't on any commercial map. He sent the instructions to the drivers. One by one, the dots on his screen began to move. While the rest of the traffic on the coast stayed frozen in red, Mrs. Gable's 3 trucks were moving through the back roads like a needle through silk. At 4 a.m., Kay's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. It was just a photo. It showed her trucks parked at the loading dock of a major hospital, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. The caption read, "They made it." "How did you do that?" Elias didn't reply. He just closed his laptop and leaned his head back against the wall. He felt a tear prick his eye, but he brushed it away. He wasn't done. Over the next month, word began to spread. In the world of logistics, news moves fast, especially when someone finds a way to move when everyone else is stuck. Mrs. Gable told a friend. That friend told a director at a national retail chain. Suddenly, Elias's phone wouldn't stop ringing. He had to move. He hired 2 guys he knew from the library, brilliant kids who had been overlooked by big tech firms because they didn't have fancy degrees. They worked out of Elias's living room, surrounded by pizza boxes and extra monitors. They weren't Apex Flow anymore. They were the Ghost Runners. That's what the drivers started calling them. When the world stopped, the Ghost Runners found a way. Elias was no longer the boy who was laughed at. He was now the CEO of a company that was quietly saving businesses from bankruptcy. He was making more money in a week than he used to make in a year at the golf course. He bought his mother a new bed, the kind that adjusted to help her backhand. He paid off her medical bills in one lump sum, but the biggest test was still coming. One afternoon, an email landed in his inbox. It wasn't from a small business or a medical supplier. It was from the corporate headquarters of Sterling Global Logistics. The subject line was simple: request for emergency consultation. Elias sat staring at the name Sterling for a long time. His heart wasn't racing this time. It wasn't full of anger. It was full of a strange, cold peace. He remembered the way Sterling had looked at him on the golf course, as if Elias were a part of the landscape. Like a tree or a bench, something that didn't have a brain or a soul. He realized that Sterling didn't know who he was emailing. He was just a drowning man reaching for a life raft. He didn't realize that the life raft was being held by the boy he had mocked. Elias looked at his team. They were working hard, their faces lit by the glow of their screens, building the future. He looked at the photo of his mother on his desk. Then he turned back to the screen. He didn't hit accept, not yet. He had a different plan. He wanted Sterling to see him not through an email, but face to face. He wanted to see if the millionaire still thought the world belonged only to men like him. "Tell them I'll meet," Elias said to his assistant. "But tell them the meeting won't be in their boardroom. Tell them the meeting will be at the Rolling Pines Country Club, at the 10th tee." The morning air at Rolling Pines was crisp, exactly as it had been years ago. The smell of freshly cut grass and expensive fertilizer hung heavy in the breeze. For most of the members, this was a place of peace. For Elias, it was the site of a ghost story. He stood near the 10th tee, the very spot where his life had changed. He wasn't wearing a white caddy vest today. He wore a simple, well-tailored dark suit knot, flashy, but the kind of clothes that whispered rather than screamed. He arrived early. He wanted to feel the ground under his feet. He watched a young boy, probably no older than 14, struggling with a heavy bag in the distance. Elias felt a sharp pang of recognition. He walked over to the kid, handed him a $100 bill, and told him to take the morning off. The boy's eyes went wide, but he didn't ask questions. He just disappeared toward the snack shack, leaving the bag behind. Elias waited. 10 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up to the club's path. A man stepped out. It was Mr. Sterling. From a distance, he still looked like the powerful man he had always been. But as he walked closer, the cracks were visible. His gait was slower. He was looking at his phone with a frantic energy, his thumb scrolling rapidly. He looked like a man who was drowning in data he couldn't control. Behind him was a younger man in a sharp blue suit, an assistant or a vice president carrying a leather briefcase. Sterling reached the 10th tee and looked around, annoyed. He didn't see a CEO, saw a young man standing by the bench. He looked right past Elias, scanning the area for someone older, someone who looked like a millionaire. "We're looking for the head of Apex Flow," Sterling's assistant said, checking his watch. "He said he'd meet us here." Strange place for a business meeting, if you ask me. Elias turned around slowly. He let the silence hang for a moment, listening to the wind in the trees. "I'm the head of Apex Flow," Elias said. His voice was calm, devoid of the shaking nerves he'd had as a teenager. Sterling stopped. He squinted, looking at Elias's face. You could see the gears turning in his head. He recognized the eyes, the jawline, the way the young man stood. But his brain refused to connect the dots. It was impossible. "Do I know you?" Sterling asked, his voice cautious. "You told me to stick to the golf clubs once," Elias said softly. "You told me the world of business wasn't for kids like me. You laughed so hard, you had to lean on your driver." It didn't happen all at once. It was like watching a candle flicker out. The assistant looked back and forth between them, confused, but Sterling knew. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the caddy. He remembered the stupid suggestion about the Savannah port. "You," Sterling whispered. "The kid from the club." "My name is Elias," he replied. "And you asked for a meeting because your company is losing $4 million a week? You asked for a meeting because your ships are sitting in the harbor and your shareholders are ready to remove you. You didn't come here to talk to a caddy. You came here to talk to the only person who can save your legacy." Sterling looked like he wanted to get angry. For a second, that old arrogance flared up in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something dismissive, to reclaim the high ground. But then his phone buzzed in his hand. He looked down at the screen, likely another notification of a lost contract or a delayed shipment. The fire in his eyes died out, replaced by a cold, hard desperation. "The world is different now, Elias," Sterling said, his voice gravelly. "It's not as simple as it used to be. Things are ... breaking." "The world isn't different," Elias countered. "It's just moving faster than you are. You built a kingdom on the idea that things would always stay the same. I built a system that knows things will always change. You didn't see me then because you didn't think I was a person. You saw a tool, and now you're realizing that the tools are the ones who actually understand how the machine works." The assistant stepped forward, trying to salvage the professional tone. "Look, Mr. Elias, we are prepared to offer a significant sum for a licensing agreement for your software. We want to integrate Apex Flow into the Sterling Global Network. We're talking about a deal that would set you up for life." Elias looked at the leather briefcase. Years ago, that briefcase would have looked like a chest of gold. Now it just looked like old skin. "I don't need to be set up for life," Elias said. "I'm already doing that. What I want to know is why I should help you. When I was 16, I gave you the answer for free. I tried to help you because I saw a problem and I knew how to fix it. You didn't just say no, you tried to humiliate me. You tried to make sure I knew my place. If I help you now, I'm just validating that you were right to wait until I had power to treat me with respect." Sterling sighed, a long whistling sound. He looked out over the fairway. "What do you want then? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was an arrogant fool who didn't see what was right in front of me. Is that what you need to hear?" "No," Elias said. "I don't need your apology. I need your company to change. I've looked at your employment records, Mr. Sterling. You pay your warehouse staff the bare minimum. You don't offer health benefits to your drivers. You treat the people at the bottom of your ladder the same way you treated me on this golf course, as if they are invisible." Elias took a step closer. The power in the air had shifted completely. He wasn't the boy looking up anymore. "I will save your company," Elias continued. "But I won't do it for a licensing fee. I want a 40% stake in Sterling Global. And I want a seat on the board with full veto power over labor relations. We're going to take the money we save using my software, and we're going to put it back into the people who actually move the boxes. We're going to build a scholarship fund for the kids in my neighborhood so they don't have to wait for a millionaire to stop laughing before they can start building." 40%. That's insane. That's a hostile takeover in all but name. Sterling held up a hand to silence his assistant. He looked at Elias really. Looked at him. He saw the intelligence. He saw the man he had accidentally created by being cruel. He was a force of nature. And if he said no, Sterling Global would be dead by the end of the quarter. "You're not just looking for a deal," Sterling said. "You're looking to rewrite the whole book." "The old book is burning, Mr. Sterling," Elias said, glancing at the 10th hole. "I'm just offering you a pen so you can help me write the next one. But make no mistake, I'm the one holding the paper." Sterling stood there for a long time. The wind ruffled his thin silver hair. He looked at the golf course, a place where he had always felt like a king, and realized it was just a patch of grass. Finally, he reached out his hand. Elias looked at the hand. He remembered the putters being tossed his way. He remembered the mockery. He waited just long enough to let Sterling feel the weight of his own history. Then, Elias reached out and shook it. It wasn't a handshake of friendship. It was a handshake of a new era. "Meeting at my office at 8 a.m. tomorrow," Elias said, pulling his hand away. "Bring the contracts. And don't be late. I don't work for you anymore." As Elias walked away, leaving the two men standing in the middle of the grass, he didn't feel a rush of anger or even a sense of triumph. He felt a deep, quiet calm. He walked past the 10th tee, past the clubhouse, and toward his car. He thought about his mother, who was currently sitting in a sunlit garden he had bought for her. He thought about the kids at the library. He realized that the millionaire's laughter hadn't been an obstacle at all. It had been the very thing that forced him to become someone who could never be laughed at again. The transition of power did not happen overnight, but it felt like a shift in the gravity of the city. Within 6 months of that meeting on the golf course, the Sterling Apex partnership had become the talk of the business world. But while the newspapers were focused on the stock prices and the revolutionary software, Elias was focused on the people. He moved his headquarters out of the glass towers and into a refurbished warehouse on the edge of the neighborhood where he had grown up. He wanted to be close to the ground, where the air smelled of exhaust and hard work, not silk and expensive cologne. Elias walked through the new dispatch center on a Tuesday morning. The room was humming with the sound of his software, but it didn't feel like a cold, robotic factory. He had designed the space with large windows and comfortable break areas. He had insisted that every driver had a high-quality tablet and that every warehouse worker had a chair that supported their back. It seemed like a small thing to a man like Sterling, but to the workers, it was a revolution. They weren't just units of labor anymore. They had names. Mr. Sterling visited the new headquarters once a month. He was no longer the chairman. He walked into Elias's office, looking around at the lack of mahogany and gold trim. "It's a bit loud in here, isn't it?" Sterling asked, taking a seat in a simple mesh chair. "It's the sound of things moving," Elias replied, without looking up from his screen. "We've cleared the backlog in Savannah. The trucks are moving at 98% efficiency. And more importantly, our turnover rate for employees has dropped to almost zero. People stay when they feel like they're part of the win, not just a tool for someone else's profit." Sterling nodded slowly. He looked humbler now. He had spent the last few months watching Elias dismantle the old cruel ways of the shipping business. He had watched Elias set up a community tech center down the street, where kids from the neighborhood could come after school to learn the same coding languages Elias had taught himself in the dark. "I saw the scholarship list this morning," Sterling said quietly. "There are 50 kids on there already. Full rides to engineering schools, no strings attached." "There are strings," Elias said, finally looking up. "The string is that they have to come back and mentor the next group. We aren't just giving them a way out. We're giving them a way to build something right here. I don't want the next genius to have to work as a caddy for 10 years before someone listens to him." Sterling looked down at his hands. "You still hold that against me, don't you?" "The golf course." Elias stood up and walked to the window. Below him, a fleet of trucks was pulling out of the yard, guided by the invisible hand of Apex Flow. "I don't hold it against you anymore. In a strange way, I have to thank you. If you had been kind to me that day, I might have just taken a small tip and gone home happy. I might have stayed a caddy for the rest of my life, hoping for a pat on the back. Your laughter was the first time I realized that I couldn't wait for permission to be great. I had to build my own world because the one you lived in didn't have a seat for me. The story of Elias didn't end with a big party or a trophy. He sat on the porch with her, watching the sunset. She wasn't wearing her nurse's uniform anymore. She was wearing a soft sweater, her hands relaxed in her lap. She looked younger than she had in years. "Are you happy, Elias?" she asked, her voice soft in the twilight. Elias thought about the thousands of people who now had health care because of his company. He thought about the kids at the tech center who were currently typing their first lines of code. He thought about the millionaire who had learned to be a student again. "I'm not just happy, Ma," Elias said, taking her hand. "I'm settled. I spent so long trying to prove everyone wrong. Now I'm finally just focused on doing what's right." In the distance, the city lights flickered on. Among them, the green lights of the Apex trucks moved steadily through the streets. They were moving medicine to hospitals, food to families, and hope to the neighborhoods that had been forgotten. The boy who was laughed at had become the man who kept the world moving. And as the moon rose over the city, the only sound was the quiet hum of a system that worked for everyone, not just the few. The lesson was simple. Carved into the hearts of everyone who worked at the warehouse, never judge a person by the bag they carry, for you never know the world they are building inside their head. Elias had proven that the loudest laugh doesn't win the race. The steadiest heart does. 10 years had passed since the day at the golf course, and the name Apex Flow was no longer just a company name. It had become a symbol of a new way to live. Elias was now 33 years old. He still didn't wear gold watches or drive flashy cars. If you saw him walking down the street in his neighborhood, you'd think he was just another neighbor, perhaps a teacher or a local shop owner. He liked it that way. He didn't want to be a monument. He wanted to be a bridge. One morning, Elias decided to go for a drive. He didn't go to the Hyries offices or the shipping docks. He drove back to the old public library where it had all started. He stood outside for a moment, looking at the brick building. It looked smaller than he remembered. He walked inside, and the smell of old paper and floor wax hit him like a physical memory. He walked to the back corner, to the very desk where he had spent those long nights coding under the flickering lights. A young girl, maybe 14, was sitting there now. She had 3 heavy books stacked next to her and was typing furiously on a tablet. Elias stood back, watching her. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the way she bit her lip when she hit a snag in her logic. It was like looking at a ghost of himself. "The syntax for that loop is a bit tricky," Elias said softly, stepping closer. "If you try to nest the variables too deep, the memory will lag." The girl looked up startled. She didn't know who he was. To her, he was just a guy in a plain jacket. "I know," she said, a bit of fire in her eyes. "But if I don't nest them, I can't get the real-time weather data to sync with the transit times. I'm trying to build a way for the local food pantry to know when the grocery store is about to throw out milk so they can pick it up before it spoils." Elias felt a lump in his throat. He didn't tell her his name. He didn't tell her he owned the company that handled 30% of the country's freight. He just pulled up a chair. "Show me your logic," he said. For the next 2 hours, the millionaire and the student sat in the back of the library, working through lines of code. He didn't do the work for her. He asked her questions that led her to the answers. He watched her face light up when the code finally ran without an error. "You're really good at this," the girl said, packing up her things as the library began to close. "Are you a teacher?" "I'm a student," Elias replied with a smile. "Just a bit further along in the book than you are." As he walked out of the library, he saw a familiar car parked at the curb. It was a modest sedan, and inside was Mr. Sterling. Sterling didn't drive a limousine anymore. Since retiring, he had joined the board of Elias's scholarship foundation. He spent his days visiting high schools, talking to kids about the mistakes he had made. "You're late for the board meeting," Sterling said, though there was no edge in his voice. He sounded like a grandfather now, mellowed by time and the realization that his old life had been very lonely. "I got caught up in some important research," Elias said. Climbing into the passenger seat, they drove through the city together. They passed the new community center, which was buzzing with activity. They passed a group of young men and women in Apex Flow uniforms, laughing as they walked to lunch. These were the people who used to be invisible to men like Sterling. Now, they were the backbone of the local economy. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sterling asked as they stopped at a red light. "The day I laughed." Elias looked out the window. "I think about it every time I see someone look down on another person. I think about how much potential is lost in the world simply because someone thinks they are better than someone else." "I used to think that the world was a ladder," Sterling said, his voice quiet. "I thought you had to step on people to get to the top. But you showed me that the world is more like a web. If you pull too hard on one string, the whole thing breaks. You have to strengthen the whole web if you want it to hold anything of value." They arrived at the community center for the board meeting. The room was filled with local leaders, parents, and former caddies who were now logistics managers. When Elias walked into the room, nobody bowed or went silent. They just nodded and said, "Hey, Elias." During the meeting, they discussed the expansion of the Apex Neighborhood Grant. They weren't just funding tech anymore. They were funding community gardens, small bakeries, and local health clinics. Elias listened more than he talked. He wanted the community to lead itself. After the meeting, a man approached Elias. He was in his 50s, with tired eyes but a wide smile. He was the manager of the very golf course where Elias used to work. "Elias," the man said, shaking his hand, "I just wanted to tell you, we're changing the club. We've done away with the caddy system. We've replaced it with a vocational program. The kids still help out, but they spend half their shift in a classroom we built in the clubhouse. We're teaching them finance and management. They aren't just carrying bags. They're learning how to own the course one day." Elias felt a sense of completion he couldn't describe. The cycle had been broken. The place of his greatest humiliation had become a place of education. That night, Elias went back to his own home, a small, comfortable house with a large garden. He sat on his back porch and pulled out the old notebook he had carried when he was 17. The pages were yellowed and the ink was fading. He flipped to the very last page, which had been blank for 15 years. He took out a pen and wrote a few final lines. The millionaire laughed at first. He laughed because he thought power was something you were born with or something you took. He didn't know that true power is something you build by lifting others. He didn't know that a boy with a bag could have a world in his head. Today the laughter is gone, replaced by the sound of 1,000 doors opening for people who used to be told to stay outside. The caddy didn't just fix the shipping firm. He fixed the way we see each other. Elias closed the notebook. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched him walk home in the dark after a long shift at the club. He realized that his story wasn't about being a millionaire. It was about the fact that no one's potential should ever be a joke. He went inside. The boy had proven everyone wrong, but more importantly, he had proven that everyone could be right, if only they were given the chance.